Welcome to another edition of China Talking Points from the Sinica Network. I am Kaiser Guo, host of the Sinica podcast, and I am joined by Eric Olander, host of the amazing China in Africa and China Global South podcasts. Hello, Eric. How are you?
Good evening to you in Beijing and good evening from Southeast Asia.
Yeah. It's nice to be in the same time zone as you. And by Lizzi Lee, who is not in the same time zone, but on the other side of the world. She is, of course, senior fellow at Asia Society Policy Institute. Hello, Lizzie. How are you?
Great to see you guys.
And unfortunately, Andrew Polk from from Trivium China couldn't join this week. Also part of the Sinica Network. I just actually got off a plane. That's why I'm all discombobulated. Took a really long trans-Pacific flight, so I know I've probably missed a lot too in the news. And I've been obsessed with what's happening in Los Angeles, of course. So haven't been watching China news quite as closely, but. Just about an hour or so ago, Donald Trump posted triumphantly about the supposed deal that was struck. I mean, really, it was sort of an outline of a framework or something like that. Maybe not a deal, but that's not how Trump, of course, positioned it.
No, they're calling it a deal.
He's calling it a deal. Absolutely. Yeah. But just to back up a little bit, of course, there was this China-U.S. economic and trade consultation, which was held in London, and it featured, actually, in addition to Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer, who were taking part last time, we had the Commerce Secretary this time, also Howard Lutnick, and that may be significant. I want to get you guys' read on that. And of course, this followed on the phone call, which itself was kind of an effort to mend after there was a little bit of a tantrum thrown over China's sort of recalcitrance on quickly freeing up exports of certain rare earth elements and other strategic minerals. And then, of course, the phone call may have patched things up a bit. There was a lot of huffing and puffing coming out of the Trump White House. But, are things stabilized now? I mean, Eric, I think, what do you make of that?
All we have to go by is what we're seeing on Truth Social and what he said. It's worth noting, by the way, that the Chinese media, here is Guancha, and then here's Global Times, and here's Xinhua, have not said anything on it. So right. We don't know what the Chinese interpretation of this is, whether it's a deal, it's a framework, or if it's just some type of agreement. And it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese frame this. And I think probably what the folks at Xinhua are doing is waiting for their directives, and then all of a sudden in about 6 hours we're going to be flooded with their take on it, but we don't know.
I want progress in addressing each other's economic and trade concerns during what it described as a candid and in-depth dialogue. I've seen some pundits immediately analyzing this, comparing the language after the Geneva meeting, London, and they say that it's different. It's not quite as sunny and optimistic. But Lizzie, what's your take on this whole thing?
Well, I actually think just the opposite. I mean, this round definitely felt very different from Geneva, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, yeah. There's no major breakthrough announced, perhaps except for President Trump's Truth Social tweet, but Truth Social post. But I think at this point, the absence of dramatic handshakes, sweeping rollback of measures, just sudden change in tone is actually a good thing. That means more practical recalibration from both sides. And I think the reason behind it is both sides now have a better sense of real leverage the other side has at this point. And I mean, negotiators came away saying, well, progress was made. But the nature of that progress is technical, it's incremental. And, as I said, it's not a bad thing. And I think, one of the clearest signals was movement on rare earth. And right. We now know, Chinese producers have green light to resume limited exports, including to the United States. And so that process seems to be warming up and restarting. That's a good thing for U.S. producers, but in U.S. manufacturers. But there's also this sense of China is not going to give up that leverage altogether. It's going to be a slow process. It's going to be a very prolonged negotiation process with potentially a lot of back and forth on export controls and also China's, release of its export licensing.
Mentioned export controls. I mean, I think it was significant, of course, there was a lot of buzz ahead of it. When we found out that Lutnick was going to be attending this meeting, we thought, oh, maybe that means that these things that BIS overlooks, these export controls, are going to be on the table. That this is something that is up for discussion. And obviously there were three things. Two of them are export controls related that China was really upset about ahead of this, and that they were, of course, the EDA, electronic design automation software restrictions that had been put on. These are necessary for the design of advanced semiconductors, and of course, jet engine technologies. And this was, and then the third thing, of course, was the one thing that actually Trump did mention, which was student visas. And I suppose, that's one piece of goodish news. I don't know whether it's going to go so far as to actually, rescind the State Department announcement that Marco Rubio made 2 weeks ago, 2 Wednesdays ago. But, Lizzie, what is this? I mean, do you think there is going to be movement on export controls coming out of this?
Right. So I think what we will see is the rollback of, EDA bans, also jet engine part, and also the potential, some softening on the Huawei Ascend chips guidance.
Right.
So
That's
those
the
are
other
the
big thing.
three things that were announced after the Geneva truce, and that was very much interpreted in Chinese media and also in public statement as
Bad
the
faith.
U.S. side reneging the on the Geneva
Right. Yeah.
agreement, and of course United States sort of think of China's rare earth export bans as reneging on its part of control. So I think after this we are probably going to be first, well, resetting back to Geneva, sort of restoring some of that goodwill, restoring some of that, I guess like good gesture toward the other side built in Geneva. So we're back there, and how much either side is willing to roll back on tariffs and other export control. I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion. But
Yeah.
at least those further escalations, potential spiraling out of controls, and putting the entire global supply chain in danger. I think that part tension has quieted down quite a bit,
But
which I
tariffs
think is a
remain very
major progress.
high.
Well, so the
Tariff.
tariffs are at 55% for inbound Chinese products into the US and 10% out. And think about a 55% increase on Chinese imports. And we just got our new inflation report in the US, 2.4% for May, which was in line with expectations. But
Right.
a 55% increase on Chinese products is a shocking amount of
Yeah.
increase. I mean, if that's a permanent that's the steady number. I think American consumers are gonna find that pretty sobering in the next 6, 7 months. And I guess, Lizzie, my question to you is: did you get the sense that the Chinese made any concessions? Because the export controls on rare earths, I can't really call that a concession because they were driving that.
Yeah.
Lizzie, what do you think on the Chinese side? Did she give up?
Well, again, I'm not super
Just
informed on all the
No, but just from
internal
your reading from the
discussions.
public narrative.
Right. So, export control, that's definitely something like a pressure point Beijing can dial up or down. I think
Right.
now Beijing is choosing to dial it down
Hmm.
a little bit, especially to end users that are mostly of civil use. And there's one exception, Sumerian, which New York Times has an article that very accurately captured. That is probably going to be the exception because Sumerian is mostly for military use. I don't think, just based on the public publications from the Chinese side, I don't think China is willing to give up on that. But again, back to your point, I think, there are areas that China is certainly willing to discuss, including purchasing, including opening up market access. But in terms of rare earth, I think that's a long-standing leverage that China can use. And to be quite fair, China's entire licensing system when it comes to export control on rare earth was actually modeled after the United States export control system, including this national security lens, including this focus on dual use and limiting military use. So I mean, there's a little bit of irony there, how this very potent tool China has right now, the entire format, the entire system, down to detailed regulations and motivations, are actually borrowed from the United States export control system. So I thought that was quite interesting. And if you look back, it didn't start as a retaliation tool against U.S. tariffs. I mean, as early as 1992, Deng Xiaoping said that the Middle East had oil. We have rare earth. So China very much realized that rare earth is part of its strategic toolkit from a very early time. And what we saw was over the past decade, China sort of steadily built up this lever. The new licensing system is quite new and was kind of rushed into system just this year. But before that, China's, sort of strategic leverage, especially when it comes to processing ability, was not a last minute thought. It was not a instrumental, just a last minute thought against U.S. tariffs. It was a much longer process, and I think that's something that we will want to clarify.
Kaiser, what's interesting about this announcement is that it's very different than previous U.S. announcements, even going back to the first Trump administration. Normally, we see these announcements that China's agreed to buy $20 billion worth of farm goods. China's agreed to buy 20,000 Boeing planes. Right. And he would throw these to his key constituencies, namely farmers. Haven't seen that in this. There's no talk of farming. There's no talk of Boeing or anything like that.
The bone to the base here is not, it's really red meat. So it's the people who still want to see high tariffs in place. That's the 55%. And my guess is that will include the residual tariffs from the Biden administration. That's where he's counting it from.
The previous 25% was also included in it. That's
exactly.
what I think.
That's right. So it's 30 plus the 25.
Can I just add one point on the tariffs? Well, I mean, interestingly, you guys think 55% of tariff is high, but if you look at Chinese economists writing earlier this year on sort of what's the long-term expectation of tariffs, I think the consensus view is, well, even after this trade tension got resolved, this 90-day trade negotiation with other countries are all done, long-term tariff on China is probably going to stay 40% to 60%. So 55% is actually sort of the expectation. I think there's a recognition among Chinese economists that President Trump very much believe tariff is part of his economic statecraft, if you will, and tariff, at least per President Trump's thinking, is a powerful tool to reshore, reindustrialize American economy. I mean, economists can disagree on that, but it seems to be part of his core conviction. And on the Chinese side, I mean, the 50% tariff, the number sounds high, but I think the general belief is when it comes to sort of cost advantage of Chinese exporters, the cost advantage is roughly 50 percentage point to roughly 100 percentage point. So 50 percentage point is high, but it still doesn't quite eat up all the cost advantage of Chinese exporters. So it's actually believed to be, painful but acceptable for China's export sector, which will be under a lot of pressure thanks to this tariff. But that's unfortunately kind of the reality that Chinese exporters have to live with in this time.
It just depends who eats the tariff. If the Chinese exporter eats most of it, then you're right, Lizzie. But they won't. And Walmart's margins are 2 to 5% on a lot of products. Okay. So, I mean, and, Trump is going to force Walmart to eat it. So either profits go down or prices go up. I mean, that's the stark reality we're facing in the United States. I don't see how this is a win for the U.S. because I don't know if 50%, as Lizzie's pointing out, is enough to force companies to reshore back into the U.S. And if that was the ultimate point of the tariffs, then this is definitely not going to be a win. So
that's the cost advantage I was talking about.
So if that's a net, then you would have to be higher than 50%. What you're saying,
right?
Yeah, I wanted to originally talk a little bit about one of the strategies that Chinese exporters have pursued, which is transshipment through other countries, especially Vietnam. Why don't we talk a little bit? Originally, I had that further down in the list of topics, but I think it's a really good segue into that. So let's talk about this. I mean, it's in a tricky position right now. The U.S. and Vietnam just wrapped their second ministerial level trade talks in Paris on June 4th. The U.S. is taking a pretty hard line. They're demanding that, Vietnam curb Chinese imports that are transshipped in order to avoid tariffs with threats of 46% if Hanoi doesn't complain.
That's right.
And Eric, you guys have been writing quite a bit about this stuff as usual. I mean, as I would expect, because your coverage of this is always just so much ahead of the curve. So, but this obviously puts Vietnam, which is a very key trade partner of both countries in a pretty tough spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us what you're thinking about this right now.
So I've got a chart up on the screen that kind of shows the fundamental problem here, that the fundamental complaint from the United States is the trade deficit is one part, okay? But the real problem that U.S. policymakers, both Peter Navarro and now Howard Lutnick, and I'm going to play a soundbite from Howard Lutnick, have highlighted is the fact that $90 billion of imports come from China into Vietnam, and then about $130 billion of exports go to the United States. Now, you see this chart here. There's just been a steady rise of Chinese imports and Chinese exports to the U.S. So the way that the Americans feel that this kind of looks is that, this is transshipment, and this is the dirty word, and they're stuck. And so in the second round of negotiations, the Americans started putting demands on the Vietnamese that they need to start curtailing the amount of inputs that come. So this is this rules of origin. How much, Chinese content is in a particular product. Now, we got trade numbers this week, and this is super interesting. So the Chinese trade numbers came out this week, 2.5% overall increase in global trade, a big drop to trade to the United States that was offset by a double-digit trade growth to Vietnam, Thailand, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, of course, is China's largest and most important trading partner. Here, Robin Brooks from the Brookings Institution kind of points out what everybody sees, that a lot of this is going to be transshipments, from Southeast Asia into the United States. And also, by the way, we saw a 12% increase of China-Africa trade. Notable important point when we're talking about tariffs, China just took off all the tariffs from all 53 countries in Africa. I say 53 because Eswatini still recognizes Taiwan. Right. But they just announced in Changsha this week, all tariffs are gone from Africa. So interesting little sidebar there. But here we have this, Robin points out the problem on transshipments. And let me just show this fascinating exchange between, this is Senator John Kennedy last week and Howard Lutnick on Capitol Hill. And this is the crux of the problem. And I'd like to get
Kennedy is, of course, a staunch China hawk. Right.
Yeah, well, everybody on Capitol Hill is a staunch China hawk.
Yeah, he's being pretty good. I'm not able to hear that yet.
You can't hear the audio? Yeah, too bad. Okay, well, we're having to use Zoom today. But basically that's my fault because I'm in China. Yeah, no problem. Next time we'll figure it out. But what Kennedy asked was, if Vietnam took off all the tariffs and was reciprocal to the United States, would that be fine? And Lutnick turns around and says that would be ridiculous, and really in many ways boxes Trump into a corner, because he says it's not about the tariffs, it's about the transshipments. The problem is that an economy like Vietnam cannot restructure its economy on a dime like this. So it can't say, we're going to cut off all Chinese imports and we're going to then, and that's what the Americans want. So then now, and I'll stop talking very soon, but here we have the taco question. That's a big problem here. Yeah. So if they, give in to the Vietnamese and say, okay, we're going to settle on a 20% tariff, but we're not going to do anything about transshipments, that's going to look like, Trump again chickening out, right? Because Howard Lutnick has set the bar so firm and so high for Trump that people are going to say, well, wait a minute, your Commerce Secretary was out there on Capitol Hill saying transshipments were the problem, and you didn't do anything about transshipments. So we'll see where we are in the next round of negotiations. But Vietnam
By the way,
I think, one of them to watch.
You just coined another variant on taco, because it's usually, Trump always chickens out, but Trump again chickening out works as well.
That's right.
It does.
So there we are. That's where Vietnam is.
I actually think
right now.
That's fascinating. Let's go back to what I originally had for a second. There was a really good piece. I thought it was a really interesting piece by Neil Thomas, who is your colleague, right, Lizzi? I mean,
yeah, right.
Yeah, and
fascinating.
Yeah.
So Kaiser, do you want to sort of introduce the piece to our audience first?
Yeah, let me just talk about this really quick. I mean, because it was he published it just last week on the 5th. It explored the evolving role of Chinese Premier Li Qiang under Xi Jinping's leadership. I mean, Xi is usually said to have this be surrounded by yes men, and he's consolidated all his power. Has a real problem delegating any kind of authority. But Neil's piece argues that he's actually delegated significant economic policy making to Li Qiang, who, of course, is a loyal Xi ally. He was his chief of staff in Zhejiang from the period he was there in '04 to '07. And, unlike Li Keqiang, who was his, uh, the former premier, his influence was quite deliberately curtailed. It looks like this is a big departure. And what I wanted to bring up with you in particular about this piece, Lizzie, is this. A few years ago, you said something to me right after the 20th Party Congress I thought was really smart, and this ties directly to this. You said that one way to look at the top level leadership, the members of the Politburo Standing Committee that had been appointed in the 20th Party Congress, was not, as everyone said, just a bunch of yes men who were going to agree with, just lackeys who were going to agree with everything that Xi Jinping said, but rather think of them as people who Xi Jinping has worked with long enough that he's developed a level of trust with them, that they can actually speak difficult truths to him, tell him things that he doesn't particularly want to hear. It also means maybe that he trusts them enough to delegate to them, and maybe that's what we're seeing. So I wanted your thoughts on that, Lizzie.
Right. Again, I think Neil's piece is one of the, most thoughtful reads I've come across in recent months on Chinese elite politics. And, I first wanted to clarify what the piece is not about. It's not about Li Qiang grabbing Xi Jinping's power, not about Xi Jinping's power being weakened in the system. I mean, every summer there are rumors about Beidaihe and stuff about how Xi Jinping has been deprived of his power. This is not along those lines, to be clear. There's a common narrative that Xi Jinping controls everything, so no one else matters, right? It's just all Xi Jinping decide. It's actually much more intricate than that, and I think Neil's piece captures that aspect really well with a lot of layers of nuances, and So what it says, I think, just back to Kaiser, your point on Xi Jinping actually trusting his appointed people. I think Neil termed it really well. It's about operational autonomy. Right. It's about how these people are allowed to carve out meaningful space for autonomous execution, and
in areas where technocratic skill is a premium.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And I think that the thing is that kind of autonomy does not weaken Xi Jinping's hand. If it's done correctly, it actually strengthens Xi Jinping's hand. So I think that's the part of discussion that people often miss. And Li Qiang is not building his influence. Li Qiang is not trying to steal the spotlight from Xi Jinping, and there's no chance he's gonna successfully doing that, precisely because power resides in Xi Jinping, which is not wrong per se. But I think Neil very sharply observed that Xi Jinping now, deep into his third term, is shifting into a more oracular mode of leadership. Right. So the idea is, he's gonna stay relatively away from the technocratic aspect, from the daily machinery of governance, and leaving that to people who trust and people who, frankly, are probably better informed and better suited than Xi Jinping himself to deal with this issue himself. And, in that spirit, I think there are actually a few things working in Li Qiang's favor to handle the economic profile from Xi Jinping's point of view. First,
trust in the business community for one, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you nail it on the head. And if from people I talked to who, worked with or spoke with Li Qiang very early in Li Qiang's career, he's sort of very embodiment of this 浙江精神, or more precisely, 温州精神, or spirit of 温州, which I think Li Qiang himself calls it and promoted it. 店小二精神.
Let's explain that. For some people might not know what Wenzhou's reputation is. So Wenzhou is, of course, it's a city famed for its entrepreneurial spirit in Wenzhou, and they're scrappy, they're hard fighting, they're willing to, they're big risk takers. So many people from Wenzhou went abroad and opened small businesses internationally. Wenzhou is a fascinating place, but just to make sure that everyone gets the reference there, but.
Right. And, when Li Qiang was working in Zhejiang, he actually promoted government bureaucrats to embody this 店小二精神, so the shopkeeper spirit,
Yeah.
which is kind of a mentality grounded in, providing service, being very responsive to, customers' needs, and kind of a small business sensibility, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think, that's exactly what China's private sector has been starving for. In addition to policy support and, investor support, whatever, they also need government bureaucrats and, government leadership to be attentive to their need. And, Li Qiang has a very long-going relationship with private entrepreneurs, including people like Jack Ma and Jiang Yiming. So this is all
But also including
documented.
MNCs. Also including
Absolutely.
MNCs, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think, that really works in Li Qiang's favor. He understands those business concerns with a level of granularity that other people in Xi Jinping's circle just don't. And he also speaks that language. And I think he's increasingly more I would say more accustomed to talk not just to Chinese entrepreneurs but also to foreign business, as Neil very helpfully point out. So that's number one. Number two, paradoxically, I think Li Qiang's lack of charisma actually works in his favor. I mean, he doesn't risk overshadowing Xi. It's just not.
He's the Mike Pence of China.
I mean, he's not even Mike Pence level of charismatic, I would say. So, he doesn't really stir up expectation of some kind of leadership transformation, which is very different from previous Chinese premiers like Zhu Rongji or Wen Jiabao, who's very kind of a overarching personality that's with lots of memorable sound bites and kind of media darling, if you will. And that kind of low-key persona actually makes Li Jiang a more trusted executor of Xi Jinping's policy ambition, if you will. Very reliable, also very competent, and not perceived as a threat to Xi Jinping. So I think those two things really work in Li Qiang's favor. And I also wanted to point out that this is something that not everyone obviously agrees with me. I think there is also a recognition from Xi Jinping or Beijing itself that private innovation is probably more critical than ever for China at this point. If you look at the really fantastic Chinese tech breakthroughs and from DeepSeek, CATL, BYD, the best performing globally competitive Chinese firms are coming out of the private sector.
That's right.
And I think increasingly there's a recognition in Beijing that, we should think more carefully about our approach to private entrepreneurs. And, again, this is a little speculative, I will admit, but I think there's a sense, especially since the September, Politburo meeting from last year and gradually building up to the, Xi Jinping's roundtable with private entrepreneurs earlier this year. At least the Beijing leadership is warming up to the idea that China still needs its private champions if it wants to stay competitive in the tech race with the United States. And that, that private entrepreneur spirit is very much consistent with China's, China's emphasis on security, economic security. Because, tech competition with the United States is a central part of economic security for China. And now private entrepreneur is actually complementary to that goal. So, we usually think of, economy, security as sort of this binary things, this force is pulling into different directions. But now I think there's a recognition at the leadership that those two can actually be very complementary to each other.
But Lizzie, that's a course correction because early on in the late Hu era and early on in Xi, the private sector was very robust. Xi comes in, de-emphasizes the private sector, puts power into the state sector, and now it seems like they're shifting back into the private sector again in terms of.
Well, I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. I mean, if you look at Li Keqiang, right, his predecessor, he very famously talked about how 60% of growth is driven by the 70% of new employment, 80 is this great 60, 70, 80, 90% little thing. And he tried to decide, it was part of his stump speech. I think that there's always been a sort of tendency to sort of say, but what about, the third plenum of the 19th Party Congress, and where you said you were going to do this, this, and this, and
no, I'm talking about Ant Financial. I'm talking about Jack Ma. I'm talking about a crackdown.
You see, I don't think that was war on the private sector as much as it was very specific in each case. I mean, the war on Ant Financial went down for a specific reason, that was a textbook case, to me at least, of moral hazard. I mean, and that was for a different reason than that Didi Chuxin got dinged. That was a different reason for why they decided, to basically eviscerate the whole after-school tutoring business. I think that the simple read on it was, oh, he hates the private sector. That wasn't what was happening in my read.
It's interesting about Neil's piece because and I focus on foreign policy. You guys are much more keyed in with the domestic side of it all. But since the pandemic, Xi doesn't travel very much. So Li has been stepping in for Xi on the foreign policy front as well. He was just in Indonesia, at the Indonesia-China business reception meeting with Prabowo. He also represented China at the ASEAN GCC summit. He's also represented China at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and some of the BRICS events. So he's got a pretty robust foreign policy portfolio. And one has to wonder if, again, we're not going to see anytime soon, I think, Xi give up power. But is there, and I'd be interested in your take, is there as Xi pulls back a little bit from day-to-day management, is he grooming Li to be, of greater responsibility, not just domestically, but also across the portfolio?
That I don't know. Lizzie?
That I don't know either.
Yeah,
Again, I think it's always it's a really tempting project to project what's going to happen in China's next round of leadership reshuffle. But I've been proven wrong for so many times now. I just don't want to make that prediction.
You didn't do
How
too
old
badly.
is Li? How old is Li?
Last time go around, you did pretty well in your guesses of picks.
Well, I didn't get all the people
get all
right,
seven,
and I think our friends and previous Simica participant Damien actually got
he got
most of the
6
key
out of
people
7,
right?
Yeah,
Right. So maybe we'll have Damien back and see if he can.
Oh, we will absolutely will. I mean, Damien
preserve his record.
Yeah.
I mean,
that'll be really interesting.
He's 65. I don't know if the rules. You remember the old rules, post 65, there was forced retirements, but I don't know if that's still in force. Obviously Wang Yi was exempted from that. Xi obviously was exempted from that. So it'll be interesting to see in the next leadership shuffle if he gets aged out or not.
Yeah, everyone's violating norms these days. So I think 6 up, 7 down is probably not going to be a norm at all anymore. Besides, 70 is the new 50, Eric, right?
Well, especially for senior Chinese officials who probably get great health care.
Especially for people like us who are, up there in age already. Yeah, all right. I want to move on to a yet another topic, and let's talk a little bit about Europe. There's always something happening in China-EU relations and it seems like I want to talk about how they always seem to hit a snag, right? Every time there's some sort of symmetry coming up. So on the 3rd of June, EU Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic, he met with Chinese, Commerce Minister Wang Wentao in France. They were taking on these thorny issues, tariffs on, Chinese electric vehicles, French cognac retaliatory tariffs, and China's export controls on rare earths, of course, which we've talked about, which, there's been some significant progress on for sure. But, meanwhile, the EU is moving to restrict Chinese medical equipment makers from pork. Or pork, exactly, pork, all over the Chinese export world, all sorts of countermeasures. But over the last 2 weeks, tensions have flared up again, right? And Russia's war in Ukraine is always casting a long shadow. And I don't know if you guys saw that there was this Times piece about a memo or some sort of intel from Russia that had talked about they are very, very distrustful of the Chinese, that they're constantly the object of Chinese espionage and saying stuff like that. And suggesting that China had actually meaningfully provided certain, not directly provided war material, but had come quite close to doing so again, another spanner thrown into the works. I mean, there's this pattern of disruption, whether over sanctions or geopolitical mistrust. It keeps derailing progress, whether between China and the U.S. or China and the EU. Every time there's symmetry between China and the U.S., we get one of these leaks about, the Russians and the Chinese too close on Ukraine. I'm wondering if you guys, I have a sort of a conspiracy theory about this one in particular. And I've talked about this before. I just want to just hear me out here. It's kind of lunatic. But if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to seduce your wife, Eric, right? I wanted to get you guys fighting, right? It would be a good move for me to like put flowers on your doorstep to her and say, thank you for last night. I mean, I want to get you guys. The other thing is like right now, they know Trump wants to do this reverse Nixon thing. There's all these sorts of people. It's like, we want to give him hope of that, right? We want to give him this idea that, things with me and China aren't really so good, but I don't want to tell you that directly. I want you to feel like you've discovered this, thus a leak. So if I were conspiratorially minded, this is what I would think this whole thing was a very clever FSB operation.
I don't think you have to be that conspiratorial. And Kaiser, you and I are old enough and we're nerdy enough to really remember the Sino-Soviet tensions and going back to Gorbachev, in '89. And I think the reverse is true. I think that not the conspiracy, but the meme that they've been putting out is that this is a boundless partnership that has no limits on it and that everything is amazing and wonderful. Right. And at the end of the day, underneath that superficial kind of flirtation is this deep, decades old, actually maybe even centuries old suspicions. And I think that Putin himself, who sees himself as the czar, who sees a strong Russia, just hates and grinds his teeth that he is the poodle to Xi. And I think that just eats him up. That because again, remember in the relationship for the Cold War, it was the Soviets that were the powerful force, and China was the underling, the poor country that needed support from the Soviets and whatnot. And there's that in the 70s, 80s, and all the way up into the early 90s, that border was one of the most tense borders in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, they fought for Damansky Island.
That doesn't just go away. And so I think the coat of paint that they put over it, and this is where I think the American foreign policy establishment has misread the Russia-China relationship by believing the meme that everything is amazing and there's this axis and there's this alliance. But I think at the institutional level between these two governments, there's still an enormous amount of suspicion.
A little bit of a little bit like this, everything is fine. Nothing to see here.
That's right. Nothing to see here.
Lizzie, what do you think?
Again, I'm all for a good conspiracy theory. So whatever you guys, put in my head, I will be thinking for the rest of the day.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I just wanted to add a little bit of levity. Don't take me too seriously on stuff like this. But I really think, one thing, I really do think, as you say, Eric, that it is completely overstated. But, I think we need to be smarter about that. We need to understand that things are not all rosy. There's a reason why every utterance that comes out from China on the Ukraine war starts with their strong respect for territorial integrity and national sovereignty. And that is intended as a message to Russia that's saying, I mean, they never recognized Crimea as Russian after 2014, right? There's a lot that still divides them.
So, but just on this, on Europe, so China has a very difficult choice that it needs to face. And I can see Yasheng Huang kind of speaking in my head right now about, how Xi Jinping miscalculated by alienating the G7 countries as trading partners. And so he has a choice now that he can either downgrade relations with Russia and start to kind of back away from Ukraine in order to give European politicians some breathing room to be able to say, okay, China is no longer kind of supporting Russia and Ukraine. And so that would then open up the opportunity for a trade or an enhanced trade relationship, because Europe is desperate now to find alternatives to the United States as well. They're squeezed between Russia, the U.S., and they want China to be a productive partner. But at the end of the day, this Russia question does hang over. So what's more?
They think they can still have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, but they're sobering up. I think the Germans are recognizing that that's going to be increasingly difficult, And so the question is, what's more important to Xi right now? The relationship with Putin sticks it to the Americans. Very, very important. But at the end of the day, Xi needs to be able to sell BYD cars. He needs to kind of find new outlets to make up for some of the lost demand in the US and the fact that the Chinese economy is still, incredibly weak. We talk about imports. Imports were down because the Chinese consumer and Chinese factories just aren't buying enough. So Europe presents a very lucrative opportunity for them to absorb some of that capacity. But again, how he has to give up Russia in order to engage Europe. And I don't know if he's going to do that, but that is the difficult question that he's got to face.
He's not sure he has to give up Russia. I mean, and I think that
but the reality is, I think he does.
He still has to, and they want to sell this case. I think that the signals that China is always trying to put out there through leaks to the FT and other things, and from the very beginning of the war, it's been like this. It's saying, we were caught off guard by this. We didn't want this to happen. We're only in this because, hey, we're both locked out. This is, huddling together for warmth. This isn't, a marriage of love. It's a marriage of necessity. And I think that's been their signal all along. And they've, been very careful, at least in the official sense, not to transgress from the, not just out of fear of secondary sanctions either. I think that there's this sending a strong diplomatic signal on this.
I mean, if you believe the press reports that European and U.S. intelligence have detected quite a bit of dual-use technology that's been sold from China to Russia, that a lot of Europeans feel is supporting the war, if not indirectly.
Yeah. I mean, say the countries that are still continuing to buy hydrocarbons from Russia directly. I mean, that's a supreme irony. All right. You guys, let's talk a little bit about things that we want to recommend. I think that should pretty much cover what we wanted to talk about. I wanted to add this in, and do this every week and talk about a book or an article or something like that in the China space that you think that everyone should be reading. I mean, Substack is still so full of them right now. So, Lizzie, you got something that you read recently besides Neil's piece that you really think was great?
Right. So the one book that's still not quite here yet, but please pre-order is Dan Wang's upcoming book, Breakneck. Kaiser, I know Dan has been a Sinica friend and, a Sinica podcast guest, so you know Dan quite well. But
I do.
For those of our audience who are not familiar with Dan's work, I think he's one of those rare voices who still constantly challenges and surprises me in the best kind of way. Maybe, with Peter Hessler, I think those two fit that category and just really never disappoints me. And, I am old soul when it comes to watching China Watchers. You kind of know, who will say what, who's speaking from their long-term, conviction versus bias, or who has a political axe to grind. But I think, Dan's writing is really one of its kind, and just, I would call it kind of meditation on China tech, which is very unique in its style. Again, the book is not quite here yet, so I won't give too much away. But
I've not read it yet, but I've heard that a lot of it talks about a topic that fascinates me, which is about technocracy, about technocratic rule and technocratic politics, which
absolutely.
I've been fascinated with this Chinese cult of the engineer for a very long time. You might not know this about me, but when I was a graduate student, this is what I worked on, the emergence of technocrats in post-Mao China. I have all sorts of ideas about this, and I really look forward to talking to Dan about his book. That's a great recommendation, Lizzie. Eric, what do you have?
Bloomberg has been doing some fantastic reporting from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I want to give a shout out to two reporters in particular, Michael Kavanagh, who is the longtime Bloomberg Kinshasa reporter, and Peter Martin, who has been based in Washington. And they've done just
author of Wolf Warrior. Right?
Author of Wolf Warrior. And you and I both had him on our show. But they've produced, the two have teamed up for a series of articles that I think are absolutely essential. One is more geopolitical on the cobalt mines, and the other one is about the Chinese immigrant in the DR Congo and how they are thriving in the Congo. Not many people can thrive in the Congo. It's one of the most difficult countries in the world. But this is some excellent reporting, and
they're probably from Wenzhou.
I can't recommend it enough what they've done. I mean, this kind of journalism is just fantastic. We don't get enough of it these days.
Absolutely. That's great. And of course, I mean, it's good to have a very on-brand recommendation from Mr. China in Africa himself. So,
so these guys are great.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Great recommendation. I want to recommend a piece called Contours of a U.S.-China Tech Grand Bargain. That's from my friend Kevin Xu, who has been on Sinica before, and I hope we have him on here because he's always super smart. Former Obama administration guy, really just super bicultural, super bilingual. And he's talking about, he wrote this before the London meeting, and you know, I think like many of us, he saw the significance of Lutnick being invited to this dance. He basically makes the argument that maybe in retrospect we're going to see this as the moment that Washington and Beijing began sketching out sort of how they're going to divvy up the world and how they'll cooperate and compete in major technologies. And this will have implications and may reshape entire industries. So check it out. I mean, you'll see this isn't just politics. It might be the future of sort of, you know, technology diplomacy that we're starting to see here. It's a really stimulating piece. And I really think his Substack Interconnected is one of the great ones out there. And anyone who's really interested in the U.S.-China tech and investing space should be reading that. All right, guys.
Okay, from Beijing. The first time we've
joined us, I'm sure he'd have had a lot to say on tariffs, but I think we covered it all right.
Well, he'll be back with us, and we'll try and be live next time.
Yeah, we'll try and be live next time. I mean, that didn't quite work out, and my fault. I mean, I should have had my wife test the internet connection here in this new place before we agreed to rent it, but so it goes. We'll figure something out.
We'll figure it out. It's the Great Firewall. That's there. We'll blame that.
Well, yeah. I mean, apparently Hainan is gonna relax.
Yes.
Right. So move to Hainan.
I'll move to Hainan. Right.
The weather's good down there.
Yeah,
it's good if you like where you live, but
that's right. I'm used to it down here.
I'm a child of the steppe lands. I like the frigid north. So, all right, guys, great, and we'll see y'all next week. Take care. Okay. Thanks for joining us.
All right, take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.